Okay, it is 11, so I will just jump on, and then if people come on later, or if you're watching the replay, then that's okay too. So my name is Marissa Laughlin, and I am a nutritionist at Joanne's Place. If you've been to the last two seminars, so we've been doing this webinars, we've been doing this every other Thursday. So we did digestion and we did stress, and now we're going to talk to you guys about sugar. And then in 2 weeks from now, I'm going to talk to you guys about sleep cycles. So let's just dive right in and talk about the sugar addiction, the sugar cycle, and so on. So some topics that we're going to cover today are different types of sugar, sugar metabolism, long-term effects of sugar, how to break the sugar cycle by switching to natural sugars, as well as talking about the emotional connection, going through sugar detox, and then supporting supplements that can also help when you transition from refined white sugar to having a more natural sugar in your regular routine. So first off, let's talk about the different types of sugar. So raw or cane sugar tend to be something I would say is coming up more and more in the health industry, and not just in the health industry, actually, I will see lots of products being marketed towards raw sugar being the additive for a sweetener, and sometimes it can be a little misleading because some people think that they're doing a great thing by having the raw sugar or the raw cane sugar juice, and although that is partially true, it's also partially false as well too. And in order to understand that, we need to talk about, where sugar comes from and how it's processed, because that's the real detrimental effect that people have when they're consuming high amounts of sugar, is the long-term effects it has on blood sugar regulation based on how it's processed. So raw or to-run sugar is probably the most common terms that you'll see it being named for. And basically what it is it's minimally refined cane sugar that contains some nutrients from it. So it's not completely stripped, which is why they can still put raw in front of it. And I think raw is one of those terms that is used in the marketing industry to make things look better than they actually could be, because people think they're doing a great thing when they're choosing raw sugar. And yes, that is partially true, but partially false as well, because the more we consume sugar, it doesn't really matter which form we're having it in. The body still recognizes sugar as sugar regardless of how you're having it. So raw sugar is probably the best form of cane sugar, because as we go down the list here, you'll see how when the cane sugar is more refined or processed, then it has more additional harmful chemicals that are added to it. So when they get the raw, so basically cane sugar is like a long stick that kind of looks a little bit like bamboo, and basically what they do is extract the juice out of it, and they dehydrate the juice to a certain temperature so that it forms crystals, and that is why you'd see it in a powder form. Sometimes you can get it in a liquid form, but most of the time it's in a granule form, and the reason being is because that's how most people would use it. Like they would use a teaspoon in their coffee, or they would bake with it. They would typically have it in that granule form. From there, many companies use cane sugar and add more chemicals to it to make white sugar. So white sugar is refined cane sugar and beet sugar. So sometimes I remember actually when I first started nutrition school, David's Tea came out with what they called the beet sugar, and they said, it was low calorie, it was low processed, it was low this, and it was very much marketed in the way to replace white sugar. But basically, we're starting at that base level. Cane sugar and beet sugar is kind of the base, and then from there, that's how we get white sugar, brown sugar, and so on from there. So basically, the cane sugar juice and the beet sugar juice, when they're crystallizing it and making it into the granules, from there they add other chemicals which will tend to act like a bleach to the sugar, which will eliminate all impurities. This also eliminates all nutrients that come from sugar. And when I say nutrients, there's not a whole lot that does, but some in its raw form, you can get some minimal mineral consumption from it as well. Nothing to even really note, but when you add these agents to it that will chemically bleach the sugar, which makes it white, it pretty much wipes out everything. And unfortunately, what this does is actually changes the structure of the sugar, and that's why people have such a hard time with managing their sugar addiction, is because it acts as a chemical in the body, and the brain is actually tends to have more reliance or addictions to different chemicals that the body recognizes. And when white sugar is going through this process, from cane sugar and beet sugar to make white sugar, the chemical structure completely changes, which tends to be why it's very addicting. Some people say it's a very close structure, chemical structure to drugs like cocaine, and that's why I feel like a lot of people will use, you know, white sugar as the new addiction, or they'll put those kind of in the same category. No, they are not the same thing, and no, sugar is not going to have the same addiction properties as a drug would, like cocaine, but it does have work on the same receptors in the brain to act as an addiction. So that's how they make white sugar. Brown sugar, basically they take that white sugar and they just add molasses to it. That's it, bottom line. So they're basically taking a sugar and adding more sugar to it, which is why brown sugar tends to be a higher sugar and carbohydrate component. The more molasses they add, the difference in the color. So sometimes you'll get like a golden brown sugar or a dark brown sugar. And the darker it is, the more molasses it has in it, which then increases the sugar content as well. So just something to be mindful of. And I think that's why most people use it in like baking and things, because it does have a sweeter, you know, flavor to it. I remember talking to somebody about this, and they said that they use brown sugar instead of white sugar because they find they have to use less of it compared to white sugar. Of course you do, because it's two sugars combined into one. So although you might seem like you're doing a great option by using the brown sugar, it's still very highly processed, and is high in sugar as well. Next up is icing or confection sugar. This is basically taking white sugar, grinding it down into a fine powder, and they add cornstarch. And the reason that they do this is so that it doesn't clump and it stays in that nice fine powder. Unfortunately, this is actually 10 times higher than white sugar. So when you're using this on recipes or on pancakes, so I find most people use it on pancakes or desserts, be very mindful that it's 10 times the amount of sugar content than just plain old white sugar would be. Okay, some other types of sugar are artificial sweeteners, so Sweeten, Low, and Splenda. There has been many arisings of different studies being done on these artificial sweeteners. If you are consuming any products that are diet products, so Diet Coke, Diet Pepsi, the Atkins products, those types of things, they tend to use Sweeten, Low, and Splenda because it has a 0 sugar component to it. So if you were to look at the back of the nutritional label, it will say 0 grams of sugar. But what it doesn't highlight is the fact that its main source of sweetness is coming from aspartame. And what they have discovered over the years is aspartame has a more detrimental effect to your cognitive memory, and can actually increase onset of dementia and Alzheimer's as well. So there's a lot of cognitive irregulations that happen when you're consuming artificial sweeteners in copious amounts or on a daily basis. And I always get asked, like, what is the worst possible option when you're choosing between regular or diet? Like, let's use Coke for an example. Diet Coke or regular Coke, and some people think that they're choosing the Diet Coke because it's the better option because it's lower in sugar. But what they don't see is the flip side of that does have such a detrimental effect on cognitive and memory. And for me personally, on a nutritional standpoint, long term, the goal is always longevity. It's lifelong. It's living life as long as you can in a manageable state. And unfortunately, when we look at sugar, you know, consuming that in copious amounts, the intern of that can be obviously chronic illness, inflammation, diabetes, which can all be managed and changed around. But when you're looking at cognitive issues such as like dementia, Alzheimer's, there's no cure for those types of things. So I actually, whenever I see a client and they are using Sweeten, Low, or Splenda and things, I say you'd be so much better off trying to manage your longevity by changing back to white sugar. No, I don't say that that's the best option, but I think between the two, white sugar is a better option than consuming, well, cane sugar is definitely a better option than consuming artificial sweeteners. So just something to keep in mind. We also got some plant sugars as well. So stevia is probably the most popular one. There are different types of stevia. So there's what they call green leaf, which is actually literally like taking the stevia plant, grinding it up and having it as that. Some people will use that in baking, but it's not as sweet and it's less processed. It has a little bit more of a bitter taste to it, but people will use it more in like herbal remedies or using it in extracts. Like if you're, doing a bunch of infusions, like different herbs and things like that, but want a little bit of sweet taste, you could use a green leaf. You could also use a green leaf powder, like it can get as fine down to a powder, and that's just taking the leaves and grinding it down. In baking, it's just more expensive that way because it takes way more leaves to have that powdered extract, but it's way more better on a nutritional value. And then the more processed and sweeter option would be the extract. So that's when you're finding the liquid or the granules. So basically they get the extract in a liquid form and they dehydrate that to make the granules. Or if you get it in a liquid tincture as well, then that is, which is probably the most common way that you would see it. It's more processed, but it's also way sweeter. So it has approximately 200 times sweetness than compared to white sugar. So if you've ever used stevia before, you know that you're using way, way, way less than you normally would for white sugar. So if you were someone who had like a teaspoon of white sugar in their coffee and were substituting with stevia, you would either use a drop of a liquid extract, or if it was in the granules, maybe like a quarter teaspoon, because it is so much sweeter and can be very, very overpowering. Now, if you are someone who does not, consume a whole lot of these types of sugars, I find that stevia, personally, I find it still does have kind of that artificial sweetener taste, like aftertaste to it. So just be mindful if you are making the change. We're going to talk about the sugars that I do recommend people to consume, but I do just want to point out these ones because they are very trendy, and I want you to be aware of what they are and why people use them. Another plant sugar is monk fruit. So this is a little bit better of an option taste profile wise, I personally find. It's not as much of that aftertaste as you would find with stevia artificial sweeteners. It's actually coming from a fruit. So the fruit is like a little tiny melon, and basically what they do is extract the juice from the fruit. They can have it in a liquid or powder or granules. Again, same thing. They're just taking the juice and dehydrating it to make granules and then grinding it down to make the powder. This is approximately 150 times sweeter than white sugar. So same thing with the stevia, you're only going to be using like drops of an extract or like a quarter teaspoon per teaspoon of white sugar. There's also agave syrup. This, when I first started learning about nutrition and went to nutrition college, what they talked about was this being a better alternative, but as the years progressed, it turned out that this was maybe not the best option because it's very highly processed. And when things are highly processed, they can change the chemical structure. So like I kind of said about the white sugar, now this doesn't have the same effect as like that white sugar chemical structure, but when you heat it, you basically kill off any nutritional value that could be there. And the only thing that's remaining is different types of sugars like fructose, sucrose, and those types of things, which have such a high impact on the blood sugar levels. So agave actually comes from the tequila plant, which I think is really neat. And basically what they do is take the syrup from that, they heat it to a high temperature so that it makes almost like a kind of like a buttery consistency, like a very, very thick, like a molasses. It's a very thick consistency, and they leave it at that. So you can get different versions like raw, which they heat it less, but it's still a heating process. That would be the best option. So raw agave syrup. But if it doesn't say raw, it's very similar to just like a very sweet, highly processed sugar option. So it's still coming from a plant rather than being chemically made and altered, but just something to be mindful of. Sugar alcohols. These are probably two of the most popular sugar alternatives that have come up because they are what we consider keto friendly. And I feel like keto kind of picked up and people wanted alternatives to their junk food, but keto friendly, which is just a conversation in its own self that we're not going to get into because I don't want to talk about diets in this one, but that's why most people will use these sugar alcohols to sweeten their healthy, in quotation, junk food. So xylitol is probably one of the most popular ones. And then there's erythritol. So both of these, just to be mindful of when consumed in high quantities, will cause digestive upset. The digestive system is actually not meant to metabolize all types of sugars, and especially in large quantities. So the xylitol and the erythritol are two of those options. Same with artificial sweeteners, really, like in large doses, the body just does not digest them very well. do want to point out that xylitol is incredibly dangerous for pets. So if you are somebody who does use xylitol or products that contain xylitol, so an example would be gum. There's a lot of natural products that are natural gum products that have its base as xylitol as a sweetener option. So xylitol, and the reason for that is it's because it's actually very good for preventing cavities. So if you are chewing a gum chewer, having something that is xylitol based as a sweetener is great for the teeth and the gums for strengthening and preventing cavities, but can be incredibly dangerous for pets. So some examples is they say that if a dog were to get a piece of that gum, unfortunately within an hour they can go into liver failure because their liver cannot metabolize it whatsoever, and they go into liver failure within, they say 1 to 2 hours. And if you're not aware of what your dog may have consumed, unfortunately, the life expectancy can be, very, very quickly short term, which is very scary. And as someone who has pets, I hope that I'm never in that situation. I would never hope that on somebody. Same is, I don't know if people still do this, but keep in mind, like if you're someone who spits your gum out like outside, like in parks and things like that where dogs would be, if you do have, you shouldn't be doing that regardless, but if you do that, just keep in mind that xylitol, that's going to have the same effect. It might be not as strong of a dose as if they were having a fresh piece of gum, but they're still going to get some xylitol, which can affect their liver filtration. So yeah, those would be the sugar alcohols that are really common. So the artificial sweeteners, the plant sugars, and the sugar alcohols, the reason why these tend to be more pushed, I would say right now, or not even just right now, but for a lot of people, is because they say zero carbs and zero sugar. So if you look at the nutritional label, it would be zeros across there. So if you're somebody who is diabetic, or somebody who struggles with balancing the blood sugars, or you are following a low sugar diet option, this is why these types of sugars are more promoted, is because it's zero carb, it's zero sweetener, zero everything. So what we do need to know, and what we need to be mindful of, and this is my job as a nutritionist, is when things that we consume have zeros all the way down them for the nutritional value, that means they contain no nutritional value. Okay, so something that I really try to promote to people is, it might look really good on that nutritional label and say zero all the way down, but to sum that up, that means that there is zero nutritional value when you're consuming. And if you're looking at your lifestyle and you want to implement more holistic or natural ways to consume food, and it builds a healthy relationship with your food, don't consume foods that have zero all the way down the nutritional value. Consume foods that have lots of nutritional value. And when I say lots, I don't mean like 100 grams of sugar per serving by any means, but something that's sustainable and that's worth having as a sugar option, which is what I want to talk about next. So now I will say plant sugars and sugar alcohols, I don't think that they're nowhere near as bad as artificial sweeteners. I still don't promote them because they're not necessarily in their whole form. And they, especially sugar alcohols, there's no long-term research on what that looks like. And when I mean that, it's like xylitol and erythritol, they do come from plants, but they are manufactured very quickly and at a high processed rate, which is why a lot of people suffer from the digestive issues from it. But there's no long-term research as to what that looks like for other health concerns. The only thing that they promote it for is help with managing your blood sugars, which you can do that with other food and still consume sugar in your diet. So I talked about the sugars that we kind of want to be aware of, but these 4 types of sugars I want to talk about next are actually the 4 types of sugars that I recommend to everybody to consume for the nutritional value from it. So first off is coconut sugar, and I talk about this one first because this is probably one of the easiest ones that people can transition to. So basically, coconut sugar is unrefined natural coconut nectar that comes from the coconut flowers, not from the coconut itself. So what they do is basically they take the flowers, they grind it down, and they make it into a powder and nectar form. So sometimes you'll see it in a liquid, or you're going to see it in the granule form as well too. This is an equal replacement for white or cane sugar. With coconut sugar, you are getting an abundance of minerals in it. It's very easy to use, and it's low glycemic, which means it's going to have a low impact on the blood sugar, which we're going to talk about the glycemic in a minute. Next up would be honey. So honey is considered a whole food, and as a holistic nutritionist, I try to promote whole foods as much as possible. They also contain beneficial nutrients. They're antimicrobial, they strengthen the immune system, and they are naturally a medicine, so they help with healing in the body. If you are getting honey that is raw, unpasteurized, and that's local, really, really important. Don't buy honey that's coming from the US. Do not buy honey that is, heated or not. If it doesn't say raw or unpasteurized, do not buy it. You lose the consistency. It's basically like buying white sugar or high fructose corn syrup. And unfortunately, there are some honey companies on the market, such as the Honey Bee, the one that comes like in the bear container. They actually have it's split 50-50. It will be honey and high fructose corn syrup in those products. So don't buy it. It's a waste of money. Try to get as local as you possibly can. And it's so accessible too. You can go to Joann's Place. We have local honey from the Autonomy. You can go to the farmer's market, go to the bulk barn. There are many options out there when you're looking at honey. Make sure that it is local. Same for maple syrup. Like there's no reason where we live where you can't get local, good quality maple syrup. It's whole food. Yes, it does go through a heating process, but it still contains beneficial nutrients at the end of the heating process. So maple syrup is a great option. And dates. I love using dates, especially in baking and cooking. It is a whole food. It contains so much nutrients such as fiber, which is really, really important to slow down the release of sugar in the bloodstream. So when you have, because dates are very high in sugar, they're probably the highest out of these four types of sugar that I recommend, but it's also the highest in fiber. So if you think of a line, picture a line going straight across, you eat sugar and basically your blood sugar, or you eat a carbohydrate or any type of sugar, and your blood sugar increases. When your blood sugar increases, it can have a dramatic drop after you use that as energy. When you're pairing it with the fiber, you have less of a spike and less of a dip, so it's more neutral. And that could be the same for pretty much any of the sugars. You'd have less of a spike in the sugars if you had it with some type of healthy fiber, but dates in its own is a great way to use it that way. What I want you to remember is the body recognizes all sugar as sugar. Whether you're having this white sugar, dates, honey, erythritol, whatever you're having, the body recognizes all sugar as sugar. It just metabolizes a little bit differently and has a different impact on the blood sugar levels. So metabolism, basically you eat, digestion occurs, the gastric juices and enzymes break down and they separate the nutrients. From there, glucose will enter the bloodstream, which will change your blood glucose levels. The pancreas is then secreted to secrete insulin, because insulin is what's going to bind to that glucose and carry it to the cells that you need to help with energy. If there is excess glucose in the body, it will be stored as fat cells, possibly for energy later on. But if you're continuously consuming food and it's converting into glucose and you're not able to use up those stores, they just continuously store as fat cells. And that's why many people, if you have addictions to sugar or you have troubles with balancing your blood sugars, unfortunately experience weight gain. Glycemic index. So we're going to talk about two things, the glycemic index and the glycemic load. So basically, first off, the glycemic index indicates how quickly a food that contains carbohydrates is converted into sugar once digestion occurs. So when it's converted into glucose. Every food has its own GI value and varies depending on how much sugar it contains naturally, how processed it is, and the fiber content and what type of food you pair it with. So the lower the GI value, the slower and more sustainable the blood sugar levels will occur. The higher the GI value, the faster it will rise and fall and your blood sugar will fluctuate. Now, what this doesn't take into consideration is the quantity of food you're consuming. It's only based on each food's level. Whereas the glycemic load considers the quantity and quality of the carbohydrate consumed that will impact the blood sugar. It uses both the glycemic index and the amount of carbs in a typical serving consumed to give you a more accurate estimate of how the food impacts your blood sugar control. So both you want to have lower options, okay? Always think lower numbers, because if you were to figure out what the GI or the GL loads would be, you still need to think you want them to keep them low. The higher the GI, the higher the impact it will have on the blood sugar, whether you are not taking into consideration the quantity or quality or not. So it's measured usually for the glycemic index. High GI would be foods rated from 70 to 100, medium would be 50 to 70, and low would be below 50. The GI low is typically measured by high GL would be 20 plus, medium would be 11 to 19, and then the low would be 10 or less. Regardless, you always want to pick lower GI foods. So here are some examples of that. So low GI foods would be non-starchy vegetables, most fruits, nuts, seeds, beans, legumes, especially beans and legumes because they're very high in fiber, so that brings down both the glycemic load and index. Plain unsweetened dairy or dairy alternatives, whole grains, and it's really important to note that actually any food that contains any foods that contain fat or protein either will have low GI or no GI. So protein, like chicken, they don't rate that on a GI because it doesn't metabolize into sugar. It metabolizes into amino acids, which help with the body with repair and recovery. Same with healthy fats, like an avocado. It doesn't break down into sugar and doesn't impact the blood sugar. In fact, what it does is help to stabilize it, especially if you are consuming food that does have a carbohydrate component, which will then further break down into glucose. So high glycemic foods we want that would be in that high number, so 70 to 100 or above 20 for the glycemic load. These are foods that we would want to either have occasionally or possibly not at all. So refined carbohydrates, this includes breads, baked goods, granola bars, pastas, those types of things that are not whole grain based. Sweetened beverages, dried fruits. Dried fruit, that I will say, maybe not something you need to always avoid, like if you're having cranberries or like prunes and dates and things like that. Those are all great because they're high in fiber, but just keep in mind that they would naturally fall on a higher glycemic index, but you're not going to always just have, a handful of cranberries by itself. You're typically having that with maybe some yogurt or some whole grains, and that's going to help to balance out your meals. Refined sugars, fast food, fried foods, and packaged foods. Those would be more on the higher glycemic index. And if you just Googled the glycemic index or the glycemic load, it's very standard charts. I didn't include them in here because, you don't necessarily need to see the whole chart, but it would be good to see, if you took the 5 foods that you consume on a regular basis, see where they fall on that chart. So the impact that sugar has on the body if you're consuming it in large amounts. So it's going to raise your blood sugar levels, congest the liver, compromise your immune system, can lead to cavities, oxidative stress. It elevates inflammation, increases visceral fat, which is much harder to utilize and to lose as well. Tends to be more in the abdominal area and the hips. Ages tissue. So like I mentioned at the beginning, like longevity is a goal that I try to work with clients is, living your best life as long as you can, as healthy as you can. And sugar can actually age the body and not necessarily in a great way. Disrupt hormone production, very, very relevant, especially with the amount of hormone and infertility issues we are dealing with in our society today. Candida and SIBO overgrowth. SIBO is overgrowth of small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, so in the GI system. Leaky gut, which can lead to allergies and sensitivities. Increased risk of cardiovascular health. The heart has to work harder when it's dealing with managing blood sugar levels and glucose levels. And then also fatty liver. A lot of people think that fatty liver is directly related to alcohol, but it's not. Actually, it tends to be more fructose overload, which tend to come from high consumption of sugar and not being able to metabolize and consume it evenly. All right, cravings. So added sugar is essentially an empty calorie. Like I said, it's not something that has a lot of nutritional value. It doesn't make you feel satisfied after eating it like an apple would because it's lacking nutrients such as fiber. Sugar is added to food to enhance the flavor, the texture, the color, and revenue. Really important to note that. A lot of companies add sugar in so that you will go back and buy it again. Not only is sugar highly addictive, it's altering our taste buds, and we tend to get to a point where we do not recognize the true flavor of foods. And that's what is actually really scary when we forget what good quality natural foods taste like. Because because your satiation is never fully met, you'll continue to crave until you're satisfied one way or another. And that could be eating 10 mini eggs or a whole bag of mini eggs. You're never going to feel really satisfied after because you're not eating a whole meal, especially if you're hungry. And it can go on for a long period of time. It's an unhealthy relationship that people can get with food. And it's a huge connection with that to emotional eating. So overconsumption of sugar is highly correlated with emotional eating, and it's also habitual. So something like if you've always had something at 8 p.m. at night, it's very hard to break that. And a lot of people will say, I just can't. I hear it all the time in practice. It's like, I can't give it up. I can't get it up. And you can. You absolutely can. You're just choosing not to. And that's the bottom line, is you have to realize that you have control over those emotional cravings, and it's learning how to manage the emotional cravings and connection to food in a healthier way. So people use it as a coping mechanism. It could be situational, guilt, deprivation. So if you're completely depriving yourself, sometimes it can lead to more binge eating, which is why I don't recommend cutting out sugar completely. Like I said, those natural sugars are ones I recommend all the time to people, and doing it mindlessly. So not being aware of what you're putting in your mouth, could be doing it while you're doing other things like working or watching TV. And before you know it, you're a whole bag into the mini eggs and you're feeling awful about yourself. All right, so how do we overcome this? Basically, we want to check in with ourselves and, like I said, connect with it emotionally. Also, the next thing we want to do is see what we're lacking in our diet. So a lot of cravings tend to come from deficiencies from nutrients. So an example, if we're heavily craving chocolate or those types of sweet things, then we can kind of link that, or sometimes can link that to a magnesium deficiency. If we're craving highly salty foods, that can be a mineral deficiency. And sometimes we just need our basic minerals to help with balancing that out, so trace minerals. It can also be lacking through the balance through your breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So if you are not having a balanced nutritional meal at breakfast, lunch, and dinner that contains protein and fat, those cravings and onsets for certain foods can be elevated as well. And then there can also be underlying imbalances. So that can look more like I said, to those health concerns. So if you are, diabetic, sometimes that can have a change with the addiction to sugar, or if you do have an addictive other personality traits, things like that, emotional connection or mood if you're using them as a coping mechanism, but also candida and bacterial overgrowth, they thrive off sugar. So if you have lots of that overgrowth happening in the body and they need food to kind of control your body, which we don't want that to happen, but that can signal the brain to do certain things, that can be elevating your cravings for foods and carbs and things like that as well. So emotional connection, are you aware of the connection that you have with food, and not just sugar, but food in general? Always checking in with yourself and seeing what your relationship is with food. Is it healthy? Is it unhealthy? What can you do to improve it or adjust it? Are you remaining mindful during your eating habits? So are you eating distracted? Are you, eating using all the senses? So are you looking at the food you're eating? Are you smelling it? Are you touching it? Are you tasting it before you're actually chewing and digesting it? Those can also really help with slowing down and slowing down your eating, but then also the amount that you're eating as well too. And can you choose a different sustainable method of coping? So if you are using emotionally as eating as an emotional tool, is there something else that you can do instead? So maybe it's first, before you dive into that bag of chocolates or donuts or whatever it is, if you could first go for a walk. Go for a walk, sit outside. Before you go right to those things, try to do something to see if you do it, and then after, if it's still something that's right in the top of your head to do. Lacking nutrients, if you're following a very restrictive diet, that can cause binge eating. Sometimes that's very unhealthy. Like I said, I don't recommend completely avoiding sugar. That pretty much takes the fun out of everything. But where can you make the adjustments in your lifestyle to have more of those natural sweeteners, which are going to be higher in nutrients, easier to digest, and more of a whole food? Do you tell yourself that you can enjoy something every single day? Again, kind of takes the fun out of things, but being mindful of how much of what you're consuming every day. The stress around eating a perfect diet has way more of a negative effect on the body than it does if you just ate whatever it was. So keep in mind that has such a negative effect when we don't have a healthy relationship with food. The healthy relationship with your food will be, okay, I eat very well most of my day. I eat protein, fat, and fiber with every single meal. So I can have the slice of chocolate cake on the weekend, or I can have the piece of chocolate bar after dinner without any guilt and without any stress, because I know that the other areas in my nutrition are great. They line up and they're nutritious. As I mentioned, underlying imbalances can lead to overgrowth, and how you can help to do this would be, some things you can do to help with these underlying imbalances would be probiotics. I talked about probiotics in the digestive seminar. If you missed it, very, very important to help with flourishing good quality bacteria and in the gut lining. And when the good quality bacteria is flourishing, then we don't have as much of these bad bacteria, bad candida overgrowth happening, because it can't thrive in an environment when the good quality bacteria is there. So good quality probiotics would be a great option to start to add in. Leaky gut. So if you do have allergies and sensitivities, some things that can help with managing that to reduce cravings can be probiotics as well as L-glutamine. And collagen, more for the protein option. So like I said, when we have protein in a high balanced diet with protein, we have less cravings naturally. And potentially a leaky gut protocol. This would be something that you would want to speak to myself, like a nutritionist or a naturopath or somebody about before, researching or diving in, because it takes a few steps to getting into a protocol like that. Protein deficiency, like I said, when we have protein, it doesn't metabolize into sugar. And it can actually help us feel satiated, full, reduce our cravings, balance our blood sugar, and can help with weight management when we are having enough substantial protein for each individual. So if you are someone who struggles with getting protein in, adding in a protein supplement like a protein powder or collagen would be very helpful for that. And then, like I said, protein also helps with balancing the blood sugars. So it is having a healthy fat and fiber, which you would consume at every single meal. So I can't stress that enough. If you are eating 3 meals a day and they are balanced and nutritious, then you should be, you will have less of an effect on the blood sugar, which will have less of an effect on your body overall, having a negative response to sugar as well. So protein, always have high protein at your meals, a good quality fat, and high fiber as well. Okay, so fiber can be your greens, your vegetables. You could use beans or legumes as a fiber or protein as well too, but making sure it's balanced and having all aspects in your diet that way. So 5 steps to breaking the sugar cycle. Increase your bitter foods. So when I mentioned that, unfortunately, when sugar is added into foods, it can actually change our taste buds, and it can change how we see food. But when we eat, and we tend to have more sweet foods, but when we eat more bitter foods, it helps to balance out that equalness in our taste buds. So eating bitter foods can really help to reduce that change in our taste. So bitter foods would include kale, cilantro, fennel, cruciferous vegetables like broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, radishes, arugula, dandelion greens, citrus foods like lemons, oranges, limes, cranberries. They're very, very tart, not dry cranberries, fresh cranberries. Green tea, dark cocoa. So when I say dark, I'm meaning like 80% or higher. Not really anything between, not milk chocolate, not white chocolate, anything that's higher than 80%. And coffee, black coffee, specifically, not when you add in your tablespoon or teaspoon or so of sugar, or dairy or whatever you add to it. Black coffee is considered a bitter food, which can help with sugar addiction by changing how we taste sugar. Increase protein intake. I talked a lot about this already. So good quality protein will help to stabilize your blood sugars, reduce spikes in the blood sugars and dips, and in turn will help reduce your cravings as well. So good quality protein is very, very important. Read your food labels. Understand where the sugar is coming from. Know the types of sugars. So is it coming from, honey, dates, white sugar, raw cane sugar, brown sugar, those types of things. Know where the source is coming from. And if you are consuming a protein, fiber, and fat, to reduce that blood sugar in spike as well. Make the switch to a more natural sugar alternative. So if you are someone who regularly consumes something that has, white sugar in it, how can you make that adjustment to start to incorporate cane sugar, to start, or better yet, go to coconut sugar. That'd be the best option when you're making that transition. And I get the feedback a lot that it's actually very, very similar when you're putting it in things. Like I use coconut sugar all the time, especially in baking, and it adds sweetness, and you would have no idea that it was coming from coconut as opposed to having the white sugar that is typically in baked goods. Monitor your consumption. So each meal should be no more than 15 grams of sugar at a time. And when we think about that, we need to consider carbohydrates, because all carbohydrates break down into glucose. They all break down into sugar. So if you are having a meal that is very high in carbohydrates, it's going to elevate your blood sugar levels. So no more than 15 grams of sugar per meal, and no more than 50 grams of sugar per day. So that is what I try to get people to get to. It's really interesting when you try to keep track of your sugar content, because a lot of people think, I don't eat that much sugar, but sugar, again, is metabolized from carbohydrates, and they may not know that they are consuming lots of carbohydrates, which contribute to that sugar consumption. So even for a week, monitor how much sugar you're having, track your food in like a food app or something, and get for a reference, like 1 teaspoon is 4 grams of sugar. And some drinks at Starbucks are 50 grams of sugar per a drink. So it depends on, you know, what your daily habits are, but trying to get around 50 grams of sugar a day would be a great way to help with managing blood sugars and to help with weight management, help with energy, improve your sleep, and so on. Also enjoy the moments that in life that are worth it. So like I said, the stress around the relationship you have with food has much more of a negative impact than it does if you were just to eat the food and move on from it. The type of guilt that a lot of people associate from consuming certain foods that are higher in sugar, or if they feel like they need to earn something, it's an unhealthy relationship with food. So trying to get away from those thinking patterns, and just, you know, if you're celebrating something, enjoy it without having to feel like you have to work for it. Now, that doesn't give permission to have a slice of cake every single night. That's not what I mean. What I mean is make the times when you're consuming the white sugars, or you're consuming the higher carbohydrate foods that form sugar in the body, make it worth having, and enjoy the moment that you're enjoying it with. Okay. So that is the end of the presentation there. These are some ways you can get in touch with me. My email directly if you want to ask me any questions. You can visit my website if you have any additional questions as well too. I that there was a little issue and technical difficulties in the presentation, but as Kate mentioned here, I think, yes, send an email to acsales@trentu.ca, and the presentation will be emailed to you directly. Kate will watch this before she sends it out, and as long as it's all recorded, then you can re-watch it again. So I appreciate you guys signing on for today's session, and if you're watching this on a replay, thanks for joining us as well. And just let me know if you have any questions. If you have any questions now, for those that are on here, although you kind of missed the first part of the presentation already. But other than that, if you don't have any questions for who's left here, we can wrap it up, and then you can watch the replay and contact me with any additional questions that you may